If a book starts with a quote by Marx, that's usually a sign of quality. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and today we will be following up with another book review or conversation about a book, whatever you want to call it, that book being a non-fiction book. As I said, I am going to do a couple more of those because I feel they're important. And today we'll be talking about Palo Alto, A History of California, Capitalism and the World by Malcolm Harris from 2023, I think. And yeah, you should read this book. And we'll do the thing that I'll try to do with, non-fiction reviews that I'm still trying to figure out, non-fiction videos that I'm trying to figure out how to do. And what I've settled on so far is I'll give you a quick pitch on why to read it, sort of like what I would call a synopsis when I do like fiction stuff. There are no real spoilers here. Capitalism sucks, but you already know that. So I'll do that, and then I'll tell you why you should read it, and then we'll go into some detail of how this specific book does tackle its topics, why I think that makes it a good read and is an interesting choice as a non-fiction book, and so forth. That's roughly the plan for today. So let's get started, right? Well, I mean, the title says A History of California, Capitalism and the World, and that's kind of what it is. Palo Alto is a history book. It's probably what you might call pop history, in that it is not exactly the densest history book that you can ever read. It is a bit more than that, and we'll talk about that later on. It does cover the history of California from the, annexation or the takeover by white Anglo-American, Anglo settlers in the mid-19th century, shortly before the so-called gold rush of 1849. That's when it kind of starts, and it follows up to, 2022, I think, is sort of the end of when this was finished, right here, when Malcolm Harris stopped writing, and so we have a lot to cover there, and it's 700 pages, so you have a lot to dig into, and that's roughly the thing. What it obviously also does is look at how California was impacted by the system of capitalism at the time, and how it did export its very specific form of California capitalism into the entire world. Now that sounds interesting, doesn't it? I would argue that it is actually really, really readable, so you should definitely go and pick it up. You'll learn a lot, you'll be angry at a lot of things, and it will help. Which brings us to the question, why should you read this book? And I have several answers for this. The big answer is, of course, you should always read histories that explain why capitalism sucks. That's just like good praxis. No. In all seriousness, it is a very well-written book, and it does tackle one specific part of the world that has become highly influential. That is, of course, California and what you might call Silicon Valley. It's, as I said, kind of focuses on Palo Alto in particular, and Stanford University and the place around that. So, you're watching this on YouTube right now, which means that you're using a platform that was developed in California, in and around Palo Alto, by people who have connections to Stanford University. So even if you're not even going any further, this makes a lot of sense. You're probably using this, watching this on a device that was at least in part developed by people in Palo Alto or around Palo Alto in California. So yeah, you're tied to this no matter where you are right now. And that, I think, is one important part here. I often talk about this in, other videos when I talk a bit more about the whole, how to do booktube or how not to do booktube things, and the sort of issues that I encounter and that I think are sort of systemic within what you might call social media and so forth in other videos. And I think that anyone who is using social media should be aware of, how these platforms function, what are sort of the driving ideologies and driving mechanisms behind these social media platforms that obviously impact our behavior on those platforms and offline or outside of these platforms as well. As someone who does booktube things myself and uploads videos, I think there's even more need for me to read these kind of books and understand what is driving these platforms. Obviously, I'm already often very unhappy with how that works, but I feel like anyone who is active on social media, on stuff like YouTube does booktube and so forth, even if you are usually talking about fantasy books or science fiction books or whatever, and are not necessarily interested that much in fiction, in non-fiction, I think this may be an interesting book for you to read, because it'll kind of explain why the things that you use and that have become such a key part of our lives are the way they are, and are sometimes not the way they could be, should be, and so forth. So I would argue that yes, everyone who uses a computer might want to read this book to understand what kind of mechanisms drove the development of the technologies we use today, and sort of like formed then in the way they are today, because they don't have to be that way. That's an important aspect here, right? So for everyone, this makes sense. If you are actively participating in social media, even more than, just scrolling through whatever platforms you're using, but actually uploading stuff, creating stuff, and so forth, you have even more of a reason to read this. And if you are, reading fiction of any kind of sort, obviously knowing how certain things work, how capitalism does often impact stuff, how protest movements, how labor movements are often crushed, how racism is, impacts societies and so forth. These are knowledges that will help you if you create fiction, but they'll also help you understand books that do world building, especially when you read fantasy or science fiction, because then you can see whether those societies make sense, don't make sense, and so forth, or just, taking things as given that we know from our reality right now, which has been formed by racism, capitalism, patriarchy, and so forth, are just like not questioning them and just like using them in the same way, or if they are actually trying something new. So I would argue this is definitely a book you should read. So that's why you should read this. Now let's look at the things it does and how it does the things it does. And once again, yes, it's 700 pages, it's 28 hours in audio, it's a big boy, but it's worth it, and it's an incredibly quick read, something we'll talk about in a minute. All right, let's start with the structure of this, because I think this is the first key to why I think why this book works so well. And that is, of course, the opening, what you might call forward, and the epilogue kind of surround or frame the entire story. And these are obviously written by Malcolm Harris about himself. Harris grew up in Palo Alto, and they start with a series of self-inflicted deaths by teenagers in Palo Alto in the, late 90s, early 2000s, or mid-2000s, and comparing them to the deaths around Foxconn, where workers also chose a way out of their predicament, and paralleling them and using the fact that sometimes these deaths occurred at the same time, why people who are the same age but in like vastly different social backgrounds and environments, using that as a starting point to look at like what kind of systems are those and are they connected? Turns out, of course they are, because Palo Alto is the place where the technology that is then built through exploitation in China is developed. And that's the starting point, and that's also the end point of this investigation, making it very personal. This is, once again, as I said, maybe more like pop history in that it is has a certain journalistic aspect, making it about the author in a way that, say, a purely academic text would not try to do, where, when you do academic historiography, you try to keep your own personal experience and voice out of it, except for maybe in the foreword or introduction or whatever. But this is very much tying the larger history to the person of Malcolm Harris, and I think that works really well, because what you want to do with this kind of book is you want to draw in your audience. And in between that, we then have like obviously a very straightforward history starting in the 1830s and ending in the 2020s. It's separated in large chunks that sort of show when there is what you might call a paradigm shift or a new chapter, when new technologies, new political mechanisms, and so forth are entering the playing field. Those are obviously, around World War II, for example. Then there is what you might call the digital age and so forth. These just make sense and are not exactly what you might call controversial. And each of these parts is obviously split into individual chapters, looking at individual events, characters, people, companies, events, and so forth that are sort of tied together thematically. And Sometimes these chapters do overlap temporarily when it comes to, well, stuff that happens in parallel, but is thematically somewhat separated. And I found it all very, very well structured and incredibly easy to understand and read in that regard. Now, have I read history books before? Yes, but I think this works really well on the just pure readability level. So that, I think, works well as a structure. It draws you in through the personal connection to the author, and then just follows a straight, like, let's start at the beginning and end in the present, with those larger thematic overarching sort of like blocks as the different parts. Works really well. So that's the first part. Now let's move forward to the next important part, why I think this works really well and is really well written as a non-fiction book, which is something that I want to, look at here as well. Images. See, this is a book that is obviously also about capitalism. And one important thing that you might know about capitalism, or maybe don't, because we don't always talk about it that much, even when we talk about it more like Marxist elements, ideas, is capitalism is not only built on exploitation of humans, but also on exploitation of our planet. You may have noticed this by now, it's getting warmer and all of that stuff. But one important part is that in a lot of like early Marxist theories, the fact that there is a cost to destroying nature is not necessarily as emphasized as it might be or should be. If you read something like Nancy Fraser's Cannibal Capitalism, which you should do, you'll see how that is drawn in much more. These sort of like costs that are not necessarily thought about in a lot of like older Marxist theory, where we just talk about labor, and then, the value theory of labor does not necessarily include those sort of like costs that are just like destroying the planet and so forth. However, Malcolm Harris does very clearly include these, which I think is important. And that is why the book starts with some really powerful images. And he uses a lot of like very good imagery throughout this book that is sometimes, returning again and again certain images. And one of them is very much the destruction of nature and the exploitation of nature. And this is why the beginning with, what you might call the gold rush, or the exploitation of California by white people mostly to gain gold, is one of these like key opening scenes, where we start out with individual people trying to pan for gold, and how then technology takes over and makes that exploitation of the ground and destruction of the ground easier and easier and easier, leading to the fact that entire hills and entire parts of the countryside are completely washed away and eroded in very quick succession, transforming the planet completely, transforming the landscape very much completely. Now, I live in Germany, and we have a lot of like coal extraction that works exactly the same way, and we have obviously had protests about this, where people try to occupy territory that is supposed to be completely dismantled. Entire villages have been taken apart and removed because there is coal underneath, and you have these huge machines that destroy the planet. So these images do ring really true and really powerful for me. And starting with one of these, I think, is a really important aspect, because what it does, and this is really key, is it shows on the one hand how capitalism or capital works, because what starts out as individual people digging for gold or whatever turns into a systematic exploitation very, very quickly. You use technology to scale up the whole thing. At that point, you have a few highly skilled operators that then employ unskilled labor that is usually hired for very, very little money. And that's one of the key aspects of automation, is that suddenly you don't need skilled labor, but you need just people that push individual buttons and nothing more. So you can pay them much less. Usually those are the skilled laborers that did the laborers that did the thing before you invented that specific element of automation. And so you basically separate divest of skilled labor, you exploit other people that are cheaper, and at the same time, through technology, you also exploit the nature and landscape, the planet, at the same time, much quicker, much faster, much more radical. And of course, the people you hire for that in a country that has obviously always profited from migration, the people you exploit for that are usually non-white people. This is the third important part of starts right at the beginning of this story, of this book, with these opening paragraphs around the gold rush, is you exploit migrants, the last surviving natives that have survived the genocide that is also started at the beginning. You exploit those people as unskilled labor while destroying the planet, and you do all of that while very few highly skilled people are employed by the owners of capital. And what happens at that point, and this is something that will come back again and again and again in cycles in this story, and I think it's really good the way that Malcolm Harris does sort of like tie these three elements together, like capital exploitation of labor, the racist element that makes this even more effective, and the brutal exploitation and abuse of the planet without any thoughts about cost. These are cycles that will repeat again and again, because what happens usually is that once those unskilled laborers do at least amass some amount of wealth, they are obviously demanding higher wages and so forth. What you do at that point is you use racism to get rid of them and find the next group you can exploit. Something that California has done again and again. When you start with, natives, blacks, different people from different parts of Asia, people from Mexico, you know the drill. And this is one of these really important parts of like how this book is structured, is using these powerful images and starting with one of the perfect examples of like how all of these elements kind of tie together. You have white Anglos coming in, taking over, using East Coast capital to ramp up the production and exploit natives or the survivors of your takeover to work for you, exploiting the planet, and afterwards discriminating against them so they can't actually partake in the larger gathering of wealth and become actual owners of capital. So that's the first part here. So as I there are powerful images here, and there's a number of these coming up again and again throughout the story. The next one is, of course, Leland Stanford's racehorse farm, and that's the next big thing that we will talk about when it comes to ideas like eugenics, because that's exactly what happens later on. The way capitalism and engineering and natural sciences are very much combining in California to produce a new form of doing business, which is just using science to maximize capital gains without any regard for the other costs of that. So the eugenics, the idea of Leland Stanford's specific practice of how to breed racehorses, is something that also comes back again and again as a pattern or image. So images are incredibly powerful in this book, which makes it, once again, incredibly readable and incredibly effective as a text. Now let's move forward to the next part that I think makes this really readable, and that's the style. Because unlike what you might call your standard academic history book, Malcolm Harris uses a much more colloquial, much more easygoing language and easygoing prose style. People are called dudes from time to time, that kind of stuff. We're using a more emotive language in a lot of ways, using non-academic contexts. And I think this is important. And there's two parts to this. On the one hand, it makes it much more accessible for anyone who is not, used to what you might call your elaborate academic code of reading and speaking, which is good. On the other hand, it's accessible. It can be funny in that kind of language. You can make jokes. You can be disparaging towards bad people and so forth, and add emotion to this. And this is important because this is not just history as you may have it in the ideal of being objective, which history can never be, but also this is very much trying to get your emotions, to get you emotionally invested, to do something about it at the end of the day. So using that specific language works really well here. On the other hand, and this is where we need to combine it to the next part, is references. See, I can do this all day long. I can ramble and call people dudes and claim and talk about how capitalism sucks. You're watching that, and I'm probably not taking me seriously. You would take me even less seriously if I would publish this as a book, wouldn't you? So what Malcolm Harris does, and I think this is really important, is put in a lot of references. This book has, and even the audiobook does this, and props after complaining about how audiobooks deal with that kind of stuff usually yesterday. I want to mention this positively. The audiobook does mention all the, at least a large part of the text of the source notes of the, they're usually not footnotes, but in in the middle of the text, the footnotes, mentions them with page number and everything, which is really, really helpful. But what it does is it gives you a really easy, accessible look at capitalist history in California with, the jokes, the insults, the emotions and all of that. But at any point, you can always just go and read individual studies, short monographs, essays, papers, and so forth on specific aspects to make sure that Malcolm Harris is not just claiming shit, but actually did his research. And that's really good. It's also really nice for me to actually realize that there's a bunch of references in there that I had already read. For example, people like, what's his name? I always want to say David Graeber, but I don't mean him. It's the other one. Let's forget it. It'll come to me or not. The geographer, Marxist geographer, who does incredible work when it comes to explaining Marx, wrote 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism. I just can't remember his name right now, which is bad form of me. Anyway, so what we have is a fairly easygoing narrative style, but full of... David Harvey, that's the name. All right, here we go. David Harvey and some others. But what it does is combine the easygoing journalistic language with a full-on barrage of research material and references to complement that. That is a very powerful approach, I think. And that is sort of where I want to leave the structural, stylistic, and so forth analysis. I think this is a masterclass in how to do this. If you want to do sort of like journalistic, pop-ish history with, an agenda behind it, which is, once again, all history has an agenda behind it, this is the way to do it. You can't do much better than that. Now let's look at what is in there and where things get kinda sometimes a bit more difficult, but also work really well, I think, at the end of the day, or as well as they can. And the first part here is the idea of structural analysis versus individual stuff. I'm not exactly a fan of what you might call the great man theory of history. I think it's usually bullshit, because what is going on there is usually that there are individuals who are in a situation where they can affect history, but they are usually not there because of very specific personal qualities, but because, systemic movements and structural elements need one person to push the button at the end of the day. On the other hand, when you look at a smaller scale of history, in this case, in history in California, there are a few individuals who are exceedingly influential. Those are, of course, in this case, someone like Leland Stanford, who, for all kinds of reasons, then endowed Stanford University. We have that part cleared, and his ideas and approaches to how to do capitalism, how to do technology, and how to do all of these things does have a very powerful impact. Now, the question is usually what if someone else was there? Would it have gone the same way? Well, we never know, but it's certainly a balance that Malcolm Harris is trying to strike. And there are a number of these people. There's, of course, Hubert... Well, is it Hubert? There is, of course, the first dean of Stanford University and his idea of eugenics that we need to start with, and the way he uses eugenics and his obsession with genius to both, select people to go to Stanford University in the first place, and then maybe puts his fingers on the scale. There are people in this organization putting their fingers on the scale when it comes to who may meet whom, and who may, in fact, then end up dating whom, and have children who may then hopefully also have, and it's all based on, the idea of IQ, which doesn't really work that well, to put it mildly, and you have all of these elements in there, which are tied back to Stanford's racehorse experiments and seem to have stuck with Stanford University for a long time and are brought back in again and again. So people that are showing up later on throughout this book are usually people that went to Stanford University because of either being the children of people who already went to Stanford University or being otherwise connected to it. And that, I think, is an important part, which then obviously leads to people like Herbert Hoover, who is another really important person here, individual person who does both both as president or before even becoming US president and afterwards, very much put his fingers on the scales when it comes to California, when it comes to politics in California, in this part of California in particular, and how things work, which is important because one thing that this book shows is that a place like Silicon Valley that is supposed to be, progressive up to a point. It's liberal, it's progressive. They're going places. They're inventing new stuff. There's, freedom, possibly even sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's not actually what is moving this place. It is, in fact, connections, small cliques of ultra-wealthy agents of capital, very much steering technology, steering society, and so forth into different in a very specific direction. That specific direction being obviously maximizing profits at the cost of the planet, humans, and everything else. Morals obviously coming first and foremost. And seeing this throughout the book works really well. And once again, Harris does use ways to sort of minimize sort of like the idea that the specific character of specific individuals was the key here, but it's more that these are you can't call them personifications, but certainly people that end up in these positions of power because of the things that capital as a structure wants and needs in that space. But it's still important to understand that with a story like this and with a book like this, you have to sort of focus on these kind of characters because, once again, these are the people that will sell the book. If you mention Hoover, if you mention Leland Stanford, if you mention, of course, people like Peter Thiel at the end, which is where this book obviously ends, you, on the one hand, have people that are expressions of capitalism and of capital, but they are still also somewhat idiosyncratic individuals, and striking that balance is somewhat difficult. I think it works mostly, but it's important to understand that this is one of the challenges of writing a book like this. And then the final thing is, of course, the local history versus global history. This is obviously something that we all struggle with when we write history. We're usually focused on one specific place or have a specific background, but obviously everything is connected. We live in a globalized world. You know that, I know that. There is the other alternative is of writing microhistory, which is like focusing on one specific place and one specific time. Palo Alto is slightly too covers slightly too much time and place to actually count as that, but it does certainly go closer, lend towards that idea. The goal of microhistory is, of course, to afterwards extrapolate from that small part of your studies to larger trends and so forth. Palo Alto does work similarly, but it also works beautifully on a second level. And that is, of course, that California as a system, Palo Alto as a system, does export its ideas. So the things we study in California do then impact the rest of the world, quite literally, because people that are built up by the California Palo Alto system, as Malcolm Harris calls it, are then moving into the world and shaping the world in an image of California or as a tributary to California in that way, which is where the connection kind of works well. On the one hand, you have obviously migrants coming to California, being exploited, usually sometimes settling in and becoming part of the system, usually getting pushed out again and getting exploited. But on the other hand, you then have California going to all these other places all over the world and exploiting nature there. So the people that live there then have no other option but to come to California to then work there and be exploited there. It's a fucked up system. We kind of all know about it, but Palo Alto, I think, does tie this like very specific local history, regional history into a global context. It does it fairly well. It could probably do more in that regard, but then again, we're already at 700 pages. At some point, you got to stop. And at some point, you might just sort of weaken your main point and thrust of argument by adding too much context, because this is where we end this. It's not just history. This is very much a manifesto. This is very much a call to action. This is not just, hey, look, this is how it is. This is very much like, this is how it is. It could have gone differently in all these different situations where we had counterculture, where we had labor unions, where we had all of these different movements that tried to build a fairer world that got crushed. we have all of that in this book. And the answer is, of course, now that we know all of that, we should probably try new ways of finding a way out of the Palo Alto system. Because if there's one thing this book shows, it's a meat grinder, and it's a grinder that grinds the planet, it grinds the people, it grinds everything in the name of creating, well, capital. And capital doesn't care about what actually gets burned up to produce more capital. And the question of like what to do about this is obviously open. Harris ends it with, ideas about giving land back to the native tribes that actually lived there and got that land stolen, often in interesting ways and very violent ways, genocidal ways and other ways, as a first start to maybe just actively opt out of the capitalist system of or idea of amassing wealth, of amassing land, of amassing property, and so forth. And it takes a conscious step to do that, because otherwise the machine will just keep on grinding on. And I think in that regard the book works, once again, fairly well, because it does do all of that. It explains how the machine works in a language that is accessible. It gives you enough context to then research more if you want to. And it still ends with, well, you gotta do something else now. It does work as an activist piece of work as well, which is why the journalism element comes in, because nonfiction of this kind is always journalistic. It is more open about its ideologies that are behind it. It's more open about its messaging than a lot of history that is published in, say, the academic field, even though, of course, there's always agendas in there, because history writing can never be objective. Anyway, these are my thoughts on Palo Alto by Malcolm Harris. I think it's a really good book. I think you should read it. You might get angry. You might learn something new. You might also just get a repeater on stuff that you already know. But hey, that also can't hurt, right? Anyway, let me know what you think about it if you've read it. Let me know what you think about it if you want to read it. Let me know something else in the comments. Just go nuts. And otherwise, I don't know, like, subscribe, share. There's a Patreon if you feel like it. I'll talk to you about something else very soon. And until then, thanks and cheers.